Hello and welcome to this webinar on church policies and procedures. I'm Roy Harriman with Ministry Pacific, and we will be joined in just a moment by Max Herr, an expert on our topic and many other subjects related to church governance. This webinar is a free service of Ministry Pacific, and we provide webinars and numerous free resources for our clients to help them become more effective in their work and to equip them to reduce risk. Ministry Pacific is not an insurance company, it's an insurance broker, and we are exclusively committed to serving churches and nonprofit organizations. Being a broker means we don't work for insurance companies, we work for you. So we're totally free, completely free to help you find the best policy for you, regardless of who is selling it. And in addition to helping you secure coverage, we help you get your claims processed, and we provide resources and access to experts like you're experiencing right now. So if you have an insurance need, consultations are always free with us. Without further ado, I want to introduce Max. He is president of Church and Ministry Compliance Consulting and is an authoritative resource for Ministry Pacific and our clients. He has more than 25 years of experience in insurance, financial services, compliance, and governance. Those include 10 years as a church treasurer and 6 years as a compliance specialist for the California Southern Baptist Convention. So Max, thank you again for joining us today and sharing your expertise. And I am going to pass the microphone and the screen over to you.
Good morning. Good morning to everyone, coming to you from my office in Southern California, about 30 miles east of downtown Los Angeles in the city of Pomona. Today, we're talking about policies and procedures, and as the subtext says, the key to effective and flexible church governance, compliance, and overall operations. This webinar is really a follow-on to the Governance Through Bylaws webinar that we did, and so I want to quickly recap some of the information from that presentation. After articles of incorporation, a church's bylaws are the most critical guiding document of the church. They provide critical structure for governance, and without a set of bylaws, a church's governance is dictated by state law. When it comes to creating or amending bylaws, it's a deliberate, and I like to use the word intentional process. The wording that you use in your bylaws really does need to be intentional. There's no universal set of bylaws that you can draw from. I do have model sets of bylaws that I can provide, but the personality of the church really is the item that needs to control behind the scenes in the bylaws. And most importantly, bylaws really need to differentiate between the two personalities of the church. One is civil and the other is spiritual. And bylaws deal with primarily the civil side of the church. And as you're going to see today, policies and procedures can be much more spiritually oriented as they work in conjunction with the bylaws. Existing bylaws, just like machinery, they require periodic maintenance. They need to be reviewed and occasionally updated. The reason for this is that bylaws as a governing document, they have to be followed. But bylaws as a structural element of the church should not be completely inflexible. In many ways, bylaws need to anticipate unplanned needs. Bylaws are also a strictly internal document. Policies and procedures are an internal document. You don't file them with government agencies. You may be asked to provide a copy with an application for a grant, or if you're applying to the IRS for a determination letter, you're going to be asked to supply a copy of your bylaws. They're not going to tell you your bylaws are wrong. They just want to see what your governance is. Your insurance company expects you to have current copies of both bylaws and policies and procedures. They need to be accessible at all times. Roy and I were chatting before the webinar started. In my experience, only about 10 or 15% of the churches I've ever worked with, and it's hundreds of churches, actually have a policy and procedures manual on the shelf somewhere. And that's very distressing, especially when a claim happens and your insurance company turns to your church and says, "What's your written policy for this?" And when you say, "Well, we don't have a policy for that," it pretty much exposes the insurance company to having to pay the claim, even though a good policy might have prevented the claim from being a covered expense. You always want to have an official copy, clean and dated, not one that has handwritten changes on it or notes added to it, nothing appended to it. We added this section to the bylaws 2 years ago, but we never created a new clean set of bylaws. You don't want to be in that situation. It's a best practice to always keep copies of prior sets of bylaws for historical reference. And as we're going to see, when it comes to policies and procedures, you want to archive policies that have been changed. You want to archive policies that have been eliminated so that you can always go back to see what we had said at one point in time. When it comes to writing bylaws, especially if a church is writing a brand new set or rewriting or creating what might be called a major overhaul of the bylaws, the group that's working on that revision or overhaul, it's sometimes a good idea to create a narrative that explains all the intentions behind the various provisions in those bylaws. Because eventually those original authors will no longer be available, and you might come up against a situation and nobody understands exactly what that provision is supposed to do. Bylaws explain how the church conducts its civil or temporal affairs. The spiritual side of the church is only a minor element in the bylaws. Doctrinal or spiritual matters, as we're going to see today, is much better suited for handling in the policies and procedures manual. Bylaws create structure. It's kind of like the skeleton. Policies and procedures are designed to add flexibility. Good governance involves both. So where bylaws are the skeletons, policies and procedures put the flesh on the bones. Your bylaws are rules, and those rules are authorized by votes. It's not that much different than how laws are enacted in a state legislature or through the initiative process. Regulations, on the other hand, that we have within state laws, those are equivalent to policies and procedures. You can change the regulations, you can change the policy as often as needed without having to go back to get a vote. Where bylaws need to identify and empower the group or body that has authority to write and approve the policies and procedures, that body should not be the general congregation. You've got just too many voices, too many opinions in an entire congregation. So ideally, the process for creating policies and procedures would involve 2 or more persons or groups. One person or group to write policies, write procedures, another to review and approve them. Typically, the board of directors would be the approval body. Some other committee or individual would be tasked with writing actual policies. Just like bylaws, your policies and procedures really have to be written. If you don't have these things in writing, what I've said frequently is you have only pleasant thoughts. As Roy and I were discussing, you might go into a church and ask, "What's the policy on this? Do you have a written policy?" And the answer is, "Well, we don't have a written policy, but everybody knows what the policy is." And you can ask everybody in the church, "What's the policy on this, that, or the other?" And everybody has an answer, but sometimes no 2 people have exactly the same answer. That doesn't work, especially in instance where a church is being sued over that particular policy. Understand that there's no universal set of policies and procedures. Every church is unique. You can find policies and procedures that will work, but have to be modified. But that modification, if you find something, is more than just changing the name on the policy. When I talk about policies and procedures as an adjunct, it means something that works in companion with bylaws. And the bylaws need to define or identify the policy and procedures manual as a companion governing document. These documents are internal to the church. About the only time they're going to become public is in an adversarial situation, when the church is being sued or when the church has to go into an arbitration procedure. Then they're going to come out, and you specifically want the bylaws to talk about the policies and procedures so that you can bring both of those documents into the court or into the arbitration proceeding. You don't want to be told, well, we don't see any authority for a policy and procedures manual. I mean, that could happen, and you don't want to be in that position. What's really true about policies and procedures compared to bylaws is that where bylaws are focused on governance, your policies and procedures will include details that are not necessary or may not be necessary for actual governance. The rules are the governance, but the details on how they're implemented, those are your policies and procedures. You don't want to bog down your bylaws with all these little intricacies. The importance of having an up-to-date manual is to identify what the church practices are supposed to be. If you're not operating within your bylaws, you're not operating within your written policies, you are exposing your church or your organization to litigation by employees, perhaps by members, when you find yourself potentially at fault for a third-party lawsuit for negligence. If you were supposed to be doing something and you have it written down, this is what we're supposed to be doing, but you're not doing it that way, you're going to be found at fault, and it's very difficult to dig yourself out of that liability hole. Flexibility is really the true purpose behind your policies and procedures. If your policies and procedures create rigidity, that's not necessarily a good thing. Where bylaws indicate what the church is supposed to be doing, policies and procedures typically explain how the church is supposed to be doing those same things. The what versus the how. You want to avoid detailing the hows in your bylaws. That's what creates too much rigidity. Instead of saying in your bylaws, we're going to have one deacon for every 10 families in the church, you may come to realize that one deacon can't handle 10 families. But if the bylaws say one deacon for 10 families, technically you're stuck with that. So it's better, I believe, to say in bylaws the number of deacons and the manner in which they're elected to office. That'll be detailed in the policies and procedures so that you give yourself the flexibility to change the way you do it, or increase the number of deacons or decrease the number of deacons. Bylaws will always require a formal vote to adopt, and it's going to be stated in the bylaws. Either the board of directors has the authority, the elders have the authority, or the members, the congregation has the authority to adopt or amend bylaws. But policies and procedures only need the approval of the person or group named in the bylaws as the approving authority. Just like bylaws need a formal outline structure, the proper use of an outline structure helps to identify weaknesses, holes in the policy and procedure manual content. When your contents are well organized, the missing things become more obvious. Where in bylaws, saying less is often better, you don't necessarily need a detailed policy for every little thing either. You don't want to become so bogged down, even in your policies and procedures, with tiny little details that are not truly material. Many policies are simply based on common sense. Things like if you move it, put it back where you found it. If you unlock it, lock it before or when you leave. If you turn it on, turn it off when you're done. If you break it, tell the office manager, tell somebody else, but don't attempt to fix it. This short list of policies actually was in use or is in use by my former church. It's one of the first policies in their policy and procedures manual. Structure and content are critical, just as they are in bylaws. English grammar, using it well is a key component. Don't use legalese. It's unnecessary. Especially avoid the overuse or misuse of the word shall, because when you use the word shall, you're locked into something. If you need to be locked in, you use the word shall. But if you don't need to be locked in, you use the word may. Incomplete sentences often lead to confusion. I try to show churches to eliminate incomplete sentences just for the fact that you may lead yourselves into a situation where nobody understands what you're talking about. This is critical. Say precisely what you mean. Discerning the correct meaning of vague statements is nearly impossible. Ambiguous statements can be read in more ways than one, and each one sounds reasonable. And honest to goodness, this is what divides us as Christians many times in our denominations, is some of the things that are written in the Bible are vague in many ways, or they're ambiguous, and different interpretations lead to different outcomes. So avoid that when you're putting together your own bylaws, when you're putting together your own policies and procedures. Make it clear what it is you're trying to do. You really want to avoid Christianese and biblical references, especially if you're quoting scripture without context. Don't just put in the reference to a particular passage of scripture without qualifying it in some way to make it well known what it is you're trying to accomplish. And as you see here, pay attention to punctuation and spelling, especially the use of symbols and commas. You don't want a document that looks amateurish. You want something that has a professional look and feel to it. You want to eliminate parenthetical statements by incorporating the thought in the grammar, the structure of the sentence. Oftentimes, parenthetical statements are an afterthought, and if somebody reads over that without looking at the parenthetical, they get a different understanding. Technically, policies and procedures are different from one another. A policy defines the objective or the need. The procedure establishes how something is supposed to be done and to whom it applies. In most churches, there's a reduced need for formality, so you can pretty much combine the policy and the procedure into the same document, but that doesn't mean you can do without the written documentation. You always have a need for the written document. Policies like bylaws are intended to be followed. The purpose of a written policy or procedure is uniformity and repetition, everybody doing things according to the policy, not deviating from it in an improper way. Create meaningful ways to accomplish specific tasks or goals. Policies and procedures will not always be popular, but they need to be protective of the church and protective of its ministries. It's not enough to write policies if they're not implemented, and it's even worse to implement policies and then not monitor them for compliance. If a policy becomes unworkable, it has to be modified to create something that is workable, or it needs to be tossed out and a whole new policy written. As I mentioned earlier, the board of directors is probably the appropriate body to review and approve policies or procedures. Your board of directors in your church could be your elder board or your trustee board, but your board of directors, whoever it is, needs to be identified specifically in your bylaws. Violating a policy or procedure may require a corrective or disciplinary response. And that can be true if it's employees, if it's members. It's a little more challenging to discipline volunteers who aren't members of the church, but it needs to be identified in the policy. If violating this policy can lead to certain consequences, you need to identify what those consequences are. The objective, though, is to create unity. It's not shouldn't be intended as punishment. But members can be disciplined according to your discipline process, and employees can be terminated for violating policy. That's not unusual in the business world, and it's not unusual in the church world. But before you can discipline anyone for violating policy, you have to make the policy known. And that's why not having written policies is putting you in a very difficult position, because not everybody knows what the policy is. And if you think everybody knows what the policy is, they don't all know it in the same way. So your policies can't be kept secret. Some of your policies may require specific training. When I was treasurer of my former church, I wrote a policy on how to count the Sunday offering. And then at another point in time, I created a set of Excel worksheets that made the task of the counters easier. And so we had to train on the policy, and we had to train on the procedure. Everyone should have access to the policy and procedures manual, perhaps even their own copy of it, either in print form or as what's known as a secured or locked PDF file. And it's incumbent on the church to announce any change in policy and provide a copy of the new policy to employees or members as necessary. There are a number of essential elements that make a good set of policies and procedures. First, don't simply copy another church's manual. Whatever deficiencies are in that document are going to be multiplied in your own. What's also true about policies or bylaws is also true about policies and procedures. Don't combine unrelated things into a single policy or procedure. If you're doing that to save paper, that's a poor reason. Write two policies, write two procedures for things that just are not related to each other. And just for convenience, avoid the use of binary pronouns, the he, she's, his, hers. You can make a statement, as I show in my model bylaws on the very first page, that we're just going to use the word he or she to refer to male or female. Singular can also refer to plural. You don't have to do this to make it legible or understandable. Creating the outline is a critical step to determining what to include or not. In policies and procedures, your outline really can be the table of contents. As you organize your table of contents, you'll see what things are missing or what you haven't thought about and include it. You can identify several main areas of concern, especially those that have been required in your bylaws. Obviously, because policies and procedures affect different aspects of the church, there are often areas of overlap. A policy and a procedure can affect more than just one policy. Some of the topics your outline could include: basic operations and administration, general and financial oversight, civil and legal compliance, specific ministries and programs, employment policies, policies that discuss volunteers and members versus employees. The point there about civil and legal compliance, you want to be aware that here in California, AB 506 that has created the youth service organization stuff requires a specific set of policies and procedures. So that could comprise 10 or 15 pages directly in your policy and procedures manual as part of your legal compliance. Under operations and administrations, you may have a policy need for defining your work week and office hours, policy for physically opening and closing the facility. Every church needs a facility use policy and a description if you charge fees for the use of your facility. Key control How many churches have gotten into trouble not paying attention to who they've given out copies of keys to? Or if you have an alarm system, why it's important not to allow people to share their alarm codes. A better alarm system will allow you to give each person their own individual alarm code so that you can track who has come into or left a building and the time that they do that. Also under this heading, use of physical or financial assets of the church and the prohibitions against those things, as well as church-owned vehicles, if you have any. Civil and legal compliance, child abuse and neglect training and reporting, volunteer or employee and volunteer safety training. If you're going to do background checks or obtain DMV reports, what's the policy? What's the purpose? Facility inspections and maintenance, very important. You might want to have a policy that details some group of persons or some individuals to do a literal walk around the facility on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, looking for things that need to be repaired. Corporation filings, every church corporation, at least once a year or every 2 years, will have to file a statement of information or similar document with the Secretary of State that identifies who the corporate officers are, who the agent for service of process is. In California, if you fail to do that 2 times in a row, that's a period of 4 years, you could find your church suspended, or even worse, you could find it administratively dissolved as a corporation. And now you're no longer a legal person. So you don't want to be in that situation. So you might need a policy that says somebody's going to be responsible for keeping those things updated. Your insurance company is going to want to have a written policy on your security procedures, and especially if you're going to allow individuals to carry weapons or firearms on the church premises. Some insurance companies will say things like, if you're going to do this, these persons need to be active or retired police officers, or they need to be licensed security guards with gun permits if they're going to carry a sidearm. You're going to need a policy that discusses that. Financial or oversight policies, money handling, counting, deposits, who's in charge of that? What happens to the money on Sunday if it's not going to the bank on Sunday to the night deposit? If you don't know it, most banks have eliminated their night deposit boxes because they've been vandalized in a variety of ways. So if you can't deposit the money in the bank on Sunday, where's it going to go between Sunday night and Monday morning? Could it go home with someone? That's not a good policy. If you don't have a safe at the church, where do you put the money? You should have a donor policy, a benevolence policy. If your church has a credit or debit card, you need a policy to govern how those things are used. You should have spending or reimbursement policies. You should have a policy on contracting. I was constantly getting into arguments with the chairman of the Building and Grounds Committee at my former church when I was treasurer, because they'd enter into a contract with someone for services, and then they would come to get a check for the deposit on the contract. And in California, a contract deposit can't be more than $1,000. Frequently come in, we need a check for $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 as a deposit on the contract. And I would refuse to do it and make them go back and do the contract correct. Financial reporting, watchdog policies. All too often, churches that aren't doing a good job of accounting are not doing a very good job of financial reporting. And in my experience as church treasurer, if you want your contributions to go up, your members, your congregations need good financial reports. Once a year is not sufficient. Every quarter is a better idea. Monthly is probably not necessary for the membership, but should be provided to your board of directors at the very least. Should have a policy on check writing and check signing practices. The person who writes checks should not be the person who signs checks. That's one of the simplest ways of preventing financial malfeasance. But whoever writes the check, the person who signs it shouldn't be a member of their own household. Another typical policy. Employment practices are policies that are determined in many ways by the number of employees that a church has. And at a certain point, you may actually need a more formal employee handbook. But an employee handbook is going to look at these kinds of topics: governing principles of employment, operational policies, the records that we keep, the schedules that we keep when we pay our employees. What are the standards of conduct? What are job descriptions? What are the benefits? How do we deal with absences, paid sick leave, or vacations? Specific ministries or programs, again, in bylaws, I try to recommend to churches not to identify all of the ministries or programs in their bylaws, because the minute you stop doing one of those things, you need to amend your bylaws. But if you say in bylaws, the church is authorized to have ministries such as, and you give a short list, but then make the statement, the list of current ministries and programs will be found in the Policy and Procedures Manual. Now that's the place where you list the things and you identify each ministry, its purpose, its operating details, how it's led, what the leadership responsibilities are, what the ministry responsibilities are, how the ministry can use or expend budgeted funds, what happens if they need to expend money that's not been budgeted, what's the accountability of that ministry, how do we measure whether this ministry is being effective, who's the oversight, is the oversight by the pastor, is the oversight by a staff person, is the oversight by the board of directors or the elders, church council. Most churches can't operate without volunteers. If your church has members, you might want a members' code of conduct. Anything that involves your members or your volunteers specifically, you may need a policy that talks about their responsibilities compared to the responsibilities of an employee. You may need a policy on how to vet volunteers for a particular ministry prior to service. This is absolutely true when it comes to child abuse and neglect. And in California, with AB 506, it involves the live scan fingerprinting. You're going to want to do what I refer to as paper background checks on top of that. You're going to want to do what the Ministry Safe organization promotes as skillful screening before you even get to the live scan procedure. How do we deal with expenses and reimbursements to volunteers or members? What are in-kind donations? How do we deal with those services and materials? Another area that churches I frequently get questions on are permission slips for an activity or liability waivers. And it's becoming more difficult, especially here in California, to create liability waivers that are very protective of the church, especially with children, because a few years ago, the Supreme Court here in California ruled that parents don't have the right to waive certain things for their children. You know, the parents can waive, as adults, they can waive hazardous conditions or waivers against injuries, but they can't waive the liability of their child. And so a child whose parent signs a liability release can still sue a church or an organization for an injury that happens. And it's just one of those things. So you try and be as protective of your organization, your church, as possible, but know that not everything is going to necessarily work. How you organize the manual. If you have a well-defined budget, your manual could be arranged according to that structure. I showed churches how to create budgets along these lines: fellowship, ministry, missions, and worship as the 4 core areas of what I call kingdom work. And then beyond that, you have your operations, you have your office expenses, and you have your personnel expenses. So you could use your budget as a way to organize your policies and procedures. You want to create some kind of a format or a template to maintain consistency across policies, how you put the title on, how you categorize, how you identify the applicability or the purpose, what's the review and approval process, and then the content. And so I'm going to show you several types of policies and how this template works. So you can have a policy called a facility use policy, and you categorize this. It affects fellowship activities, it affects ministry, it affects worship, it affects operations overall. Who it applies to employees, to members, to tenant churches if you have them, can apply to non-members and outside entities. It may need to refer to those more than others. What's the purpose? In this policy, it says the church's premises and contents in their entirety is private property and under the exclusive control of the church. The church has established this facility use policy to provide a uniform process for determining who may use church premises and for what purposes, to establish the priority by which facilities may be made available, and the responsibilities of persons who are permitted to use the church premises. That's the policy. The rest of this is the procedure, perhaps. Where it says master calendar, this is a policy that affects things on the master calendar. So part of your policy is going to have to address who you contact to get something on the master calendar. You can't just expect to use the facility on a particular day, not knowing that it's been rented out for a wedding or a funeral, and now you've got to change your plans. And then the review and approval date, when it was last reviewed, last approved. This will help you identify policies that may be outdated. If it's more than 2 years old, it needs to be reviewed. It might not need to be changed, but at least we need to look at it to make sure that it's up to date. Another policy, designated and restricted giving and solicitation policy. Who does this affect? It affects ministry, missions, operations. Who does it apply to? It applies to donors, to counters, to the church treasurer, to a financial secretary if you have one. The purpose here, the church relies primarily on tithes and other donations for its operating revenue. However, not all gifts to the church are available for general fund purposes. This policy explains how certain gifts are received, allocated, and on occasion why gifts will be refused or may be refunded. Does it affect the calendar? No. When was it last reviewed and approved? And then you go on to discuss the types of gifts, how they're dealt with. Here's an accountable reimbursement policy. All aspects of church operations is who it affects. It applies to all ministerial staff, to all employees, to members, attenders, and perhaps even to external missionaries if you're funding those folks. The purpose, to maintain its tax-exempt status, the church must not permit the unlawful inurement of its assets to any ministerial staff member, officer, or director, or any immediate family member thereof, or to any other person considered an insider, such as church members, attenders, and volunteers. Again, doesn't affect the master calendar. Again, it needs to be reviewed and approved. And this one starts off with a discussion of inurement. Many churches include a section in their policy and procedures manual for forms and letters and instructions for activities or events, together with a list of their original issue and current revision dates. It's not a bad idea to keep the copies of prior letters as a way to not have to rewrite a letter the next year that you have an event coming up. You save the form letter and you just change the dates perhaps. What you don't want to do is permit individuals or committees to create or modify and use their own forms or letters without prior approval. So your policy on form letters or solicitation letters, those need to be expressed in a variety of ways. So here's your forms and letters policy. It affects all aspects of church operations and ministries. It applies to ministerial staff, employees, and committees. The purpose, to maintain consistency in the church's communications, information gathering, and dissemination. and for compliance with legal mandates or for insurance purposes. Notice the first paragraph there. All forms and letters used by the church, its staff, committees, or other authorized persons in connection with its ministries, missions, and activities must be approved by the church council or the board of directors prior to their first use. This policy does not apply to ordinary correspondence in the course of business. The council or board may delegate approval authority to the church administrator, and if so, the administrator will appropriately notify the council or board of each such approval. Just explaining how we're doing things and who we're giving authority to. That's the purpose behind policies and procedures. When it comes to creating policies, you can rely on impartial resources. Your liability insurance company often has samples of recommended policies and procedures that you can modify to fit your church. Again, you don't just take it and stick your name on it. You need to read through the policy and make sure that it actually applies or works in your church's way of doing things. Third-party organizations may offer sample policies and procedures for operations, for financial matters, security issues, and more. The EFCA, ECFA, Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, has a variety of policies for money handling and accountability with church resources. Requirements imposed by law. Some policies or procedures will be responsive to employment laws or civil or criminal laws. Paid sick leave, pregnancy leave, child abuse and neglect, and mandated reporting. There are also state and federal laws that protect against discrimination, but there are religious exemptions that churches and other religious organizations can definitely take advantage of. Although it's unlawful in the real world, the outside world, the secular world, to discriminate against the LGBTQ community, the church as a religious institution can say, for example, in its facility use policy, that we do not open the worship center for marriages to non-member. Then within your members' code of conduct, you can address, however you choose to, your church's position on LGBTQ lifestyle. And if a person's lifestyle doesn't comport with that, then your membership statement in your bylaws would say that a person, to be an active member, must comply with the members' code of conduct. So all these things can interrelate. You may have a gay or lesbian person as a member of your church, but the combination of your facility use policy, your members' code of conduct, and their lifestyle come together and say, well, we aren't going to kick you out as a member, but you certainly can't use the church for your wedding ceremony. Discussing places of public accommodation. You don't want to inadvertently turn your church into a place of public accommodation. So you explain in your policies that when you allow outside organizations to use particular parts of your campus, you're doing so in a way that does not open the entire campus to being described as a place of public accommodation. Your worship center, if it's an auditorium type facility, you can open that up to the use of the school district for a piano recital. If they don't have a place where a couple of hundred people can come listen to students perform, it's not being used for a worship purpose. And again, you want to describe worship purposes in your bylaws. Churches have long been advised to adopt alternative dispute resolution, what's known as ADR policies for employees and members in an effort to avoid civil litigation. There are organizations that provide mediation and arbitration in a Christian context. Variations in state law, however, will require specific legal guidance because some states are very much in disfavor of arbitration. California is very much in favor of arbitration. So an arbitration policy that works in California might not work in Ohio, for example, where arbitration is not a preferred mechanism. Anything you can do to keep your church out of the civil court and keep it in a biblical context can allow you to draw on biblical principles for settling a dispute, where in civil court, the Bible is definitely going to take a back seat to state law or federal law. Some basic rules apply when it comes to ADR. Generally, a party's advance written acceptance of the ADR process is necessary. And so if you're going to include alternative dispute resolution as part of your policy and procedures manual that applies to employees and members, you want them to sign that they received a copy of the policy. Their signature is their acceptance of that policy. Every arbitration, in order to satisfy state law where it's available, must give the arbitrator the authority to determine whether the matter is subject to arbitration or not. And if it's determined that the arbitrator did not have the authority to determine the arbitration or the arbitrability of a matter, that's going to go to the civil court first. So you're not going to find yourself totally protected with your ADR policy. Mediation is based on voluntary acceptance of the mediator's recommendation. Arbitration, especially what's called binding arbitration, if handled properly, is not normally reviewable by a court other than to make sure that it was procedurally proper. But understand that arbitration and writing an arbitration policy is definitely not a do-it-yourself proposition. It's very technical, although arbitration itself is less expensive than civil litigation. You need to address, the arbitration policy needs to address the expenses involved. Who pays what? Normally, each party pays its own side of the arbitration. There needs to be administrative relief in a process that precedes arbitration. You want to detail those preliminary processes, because a person's failure to exhaust what are called administrative remedies results in a denial of their ability to arbitrate a matter. And if they can't arbitrate it and they can't take it to court, then it's not going to be a problem for the church. Arbitration always is the last resort to resolving conflict. If you can resolve it peaceably, even before you get to a paid mediator, you're much better off. And this is why, if we go back to the discussion of bylaws, I don't like to see the pastor being forced to be the moderator of church business meetings. Church business meetings sometimes get out of control. And if the moderator loses control, you get a lot of tension between the pro and the con side over an issue. If the pastor is the moderator, you've taken away the pastor's ability to suddenly step in as the mediator. But if the pastor is sitting on the sidelines while somebody else is moderating the meeting, the pastor can step in, calm things down, and act as the mediator. And very often, the pastor can be the mediator of conflict in the church between members, or between members and staff persons, instead of having to take it outside the church. If your church is contracting with a painter or a plumber, an electrician, or a landscaper or gardening service, you might want to show them your arbitration policy and get their voluntary acceptance of the church's ADR process. You can't force them to accept it, but if they don't accept it, you don't have to do business with them either. It's a choice that you can make. If your contractor has a contract that includes an arbitration provision, you can accept that arbitration provision, or you can come to an agreement that you'll use your Christian arbitration process. So lots of ways to deal with that and still come up with a good contract. Your arbitration policy or ADR policy needs to select a specific provider. Peacemaker Ministries is one Christian organization. The Institute for Christian Conciliation is another Christian organization. JAMS and the American Arbitration Association, they're both secular in nature. Any one of those four will provide a church with good arbitration services. But if you want to keep it in the Christian context and the biblical context, I would recommend either of those first two. You want to distribute your arbitration provision to your church members. You have all your adults sign that agreement. Determine in advance whether the church will pay half of the initial fees or all of the initial fees to make it convenient to open an arbitration. You don't want somebody to not be able to arbitrate because they don't have the funds to pay their share of the arbitration. So normally I recommend to churches that you agree to pay the initial fee. When the arbitrator makes a final decision, if necessary, they can reapportion that fee to the other party. But generally in arbitration, the parties bear their own expense of arbitration when complete. The arbitrator or arbitrators are going to have an hourly fee. If you hire attorneys to represent you in arbitration, you're definitely going to be responsible for your attorney's own fees. When it comes to employees, if your church has 5 or more employees, you probably need to consider using a professional handbook service, especially in comparison to trying to compile a do-it-yourself version, which is possible, but it's not often practical. There are organizations such as BLR that has its employee handbook builder. I'm very familiar with that. I administer employee handbooks for a couple of organizations using the BLR employee handbook builder subscription service. The Paychecks organization that does payroll also has an HR handbook component. There's an organization called My HR Concierge that can provide you with employee handbooks. The value of a professional handbook resource is that their software generally employs an interview type process that helps identify the policies that are required versus the policies that are optional, especially when you have conflicting or layered federal and state laws. Most of these professional handbook services, the policies that they provide are lawyer reviewed for compliance, and their instructions to you are don't substantially alter these policies in their language. The setup of the software will plug in the names of persons that would be the approving authority or the resource authority of a particular policy. Employee handbooks are usually organized in a very logical format or sequence. They'll start out with governing principles of employment, move on to operational policies, general standards of conduct, and general policies and procedures. They'll move on to job descriptions and classifications, to acknowledgments, to benefits, to leaves of absence, whether they're mandated or voluntary. So this is a table of contents for one of the organizations whose handbooks I administer. And you can see how it's set up. Section 1, governing principles of employment. And each policy is numbered 1-1, 1-2, 1-3, 1-4. This is a very logical format for organizing a handbook. Essential employment policies must cover relevant topics, non-discrimination other than religious, paid sick leave, and mandated leave, the Fair Labor Standards Act or state labor regulations as applies. Here in California, we have the state labor code, which is patterned after the FLSA, but generally it supersedes most of the federal labor laws. It's going to discuss the differences between exempt, non-exempt, and contract workers. And we've had a webinar in the past on misclassifying employees as contractors, and you don't want to get yourself in that situation. Beyond required policies, a handbook needs to cover basic responsibilities and privileges, the general standards of behavior, how we deal with harassment, what's our defined work week, what's our regular business hours, personal use of church assets and the prohibitions. Churches have discovered that their youth minister or a committee chairperson who has a key to the office has come in and made thousands of copies of things on the copier machine that have nothing to do with the church, and that's the misuse of church assets. How to use social media on or off the job. In an employment circumstance, your policy might say that employees are prohibited from posting on social media relative to their employment. It doesn't mean they can't post relative to their own personal circumstance, but they can't be doing it during work hours. As I mentioned earlier, most churches rely on volunteers to perform certain functions instead of hiring employees. What you need to know specifically is that a volunteer is a person who serves with no expectation of compensation for their services. And the fastest way to turn a volunteer into an employee is to give them money for what they do. In your volunteer policy, you want to be very explicit that volunteers serve with no expectation of compensation. You can give token appreciations, $10 or $20 gift card. You can give Christmas gifts to committee chairpersons and things. What you don't want to do is tell somebody, if you volunteer for this thing, we'll give you $100 to spend a few hours here on a Saturday. You don't want to get into that because now you've just turned that volunteer into an employee. Also, you need to know that whether it's state or federal governing your employment situation, employees cannot volunteer their services and do the same work for which they're paid. This is considered off-the-clock work and it's prohibited. Your church office manager can volunteer as a nursery worker on Sunday morning, but if your church office manager routinely has something to do with the Sunday offering, like taking it to the bank, your office manager has to be paid if they're a counter on Sunday. They can't volunteer in that capacity that has contact with the money. So you got to be very careful about those things. And part of your employee handbook is going to discuss off-the-clock work, that it's not permissible. You want to treat volunteers, my recommendation, as if they're employees. You can say to your volunteers, most of these employment policies apply to you as a volunteer. Certainly not the ones that deal with compensation or paid time off. Things like the policy against harassment is going to apply to a volunteer just as if they were an employee. Your volunteers, the folks at Ministry Pacific, your agents will tell you, you should include your volunteers under the workers' comp coverage that your policy or that your church has for its employees. So that if a volunteer gets hurt in an activity sanctioned by the church, your workers' comp policy will pay for their medical bills or perhaps rehabilitation if it's that serious, as opposed to your general liability insurance. That helps keep down the cost of your liability insurance. Again, many employment practices and policies are still applicable to volunteers, even though they're not paid individuals. The benefits of a professional handbook. The subscription to a professional handbook service will provide you with proper language and details. You're going to get policies based on and worded based on the number of employees that you have. The policies are lawyer reviewed, and where necessary, they're going to be state specific and use state specific language. And they'll automatically be updated as often as necessary. If something changes in the state regulatory environment, they're on it, and you get an email that says the policy has been updated to reflect a change that takes effect on July 1st. Other advantages, you can indicate which policies apply to volunteers. And even more than that, especially the BLR employee handbook builder that I'm familiar with, you can actually turn that into a complete policy and procedures manual simply by adding additional sections. It's designed to be distributed electronically. When an employee or a volunteer gets it, they sign the acknowledgement page and return it to the church. That way you have a record of it being received. Closing thoughts. If your church doesn't have a policy and procedures manual today, it won't until somebody decides it needs one. It definitely won't be compiled in a single day, in a single week, or a single month. It will definitely help the church to operate more effectively. It will always be a work in progress. And going back to that first bullet point, it won't happen until someone decides it needs one. Many policies and procedures are developed when the church encounters a problem it hasn't encountered before. Something came up, something happened, and we realize we don't have a policy to cover it. If you don't have a credit card or debit card spending policy, and you suddenly discover that somebody has used the debit card to buy a $2,000 item that wasn't budgeted, how do you deal with that? It's difficult when you don't have a policy to deal with it. When I get those phone calls from a church, somebody spent money that we didn't budget and now they're demanding to be reimbursed. How do we deal with that? I usually tell them, give them a in-kind donation receipt. Tell them, thank you for your contribution, but we're not giving you the money to represent it because it wasn't authorized in the budget. You didn't ask anybody for permission to spend that money. Well, but the church needs it. Maybe so, but until the church decides to spend the money, you don't have the authority to spend it, not in the name of the church. You don't have to wing it when it comes to compiling a policy and procedures manual. My organization can help you. We don't charge anything for our assistance. All you have to do is ask, write, or call anytime. Third-party organizations that charge money for what they do, and you can spend hundreds or thousands of dollars for policies and procedures that may not work properly for your church, and I wouldn't want to see you do that. Subscriptions to things like the Employee Handbook Builder, that's going to cost your church about $400 a year. That's money that's well spent if you have 5 or more employees, just because there's so many different moving parts to employee HR that you don't want to overlook anything in particular.
Max, we want to honor our time here. Anything that you would like to say to those who have joined us that you haven't been able to communicate so far?
And just, feel free to call me or email me with questions or concerns.
Excellent. And a great point on finding policies that fit your church's need, because now you could even go out to an AI tool and ask it to suggest a church policy for you, right? And just because it sounds reasonable doesn't mean it fits for your organization. Right. So
yeah, it could be very secular in nature and expose the church in ways that you don't even comprehend.
Well, we want to, Max, thank you again for sharing your great insight. We want to thank everyone who has joined us today and for your commitment and interest in doing what's right for your church, even when it's not maybe the most celebratory activity. It's essential and important to ministry. And at Ministry Pacific, please contact us if we can answer any questions about liability insurance, property insurance, and consultations are always free. We appreciate your time today. Have a wonderful rest of your week.